Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Vallis. I'm the Associate Director of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress. Today, we are thrilled to be hosting our fourth Talk Poverty Live, which is a monthly online interactive conversation about poverty and how we can reduce it. In addition to our guests, we would like to hear from you. So please tweet questions for any of our guests at the Twitter handle @TalkPoverty, or you can also post them on the TalkPoverty.org Facebook page anytime throughout the conversation using the hashtag #TalkPovertyLive, and we will answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion at the end of today's show. Remember that each month we always lift up a Poverty Hero of the Month. Today we wanted to highlight Ebony Gonzalez-Dixon. She's a 17-year-old from Phoenix, Arizona, and she won our Half in 10 National Art Competition, which focused on how we reduce poverty and enable everyone to achieve the American dream. She is also an incredibly active leader in her community. She does hundreds of hours of community service to make positive change. She joined us in DC earlier this week to further advocate for poverty reduction. If you'd like to nominate a future Hero of the Month, you can email your nomination to info@talkpoverty.org. But this month, congratulations to Ebony. So now I'd like to kick off this month's Talk Poverty Live by introducing our guests. We have quite the distinguished panel this month. We have Jared Bernstein with us. He's a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He's also former chief economist and advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. Also with us, we have Jody Levin-Epstein, who is the Deputy Director at the Center for Law and Social Policy, which most of us know as CLASP. And then finally, we have Daryl Atkinson, who is a staff attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. I think just to kick things off here, I think as folks know, a few weeks ago, the U.S. Census Bureau released its annual figures on poverty, income, and health insurance. Those data revealed that 4 years into the economic recovery, economic insecurity remains widespread, and low and middle income workers have seen no significant wage growth over the past decade, with the poverty rate remaining at an unacceptable 14.5% and economic inequality stuck at historically high levels. One might assume that there's really nothing we can do, that chronic economic insecurity and an off-kilter economy are the new normal. But there's nothing normal or inevitable about more than 45 million Americans living in poverty. It's the direct result of policy choices. With different policy choices, we'll see a more equitable economy. It's just as simple as that. And so that's what we wanted to have a conversation about today, is what are the steps that Congress and local policymakers as well can take to cut poverty, boost economic security, and expand the middle class. So I'd like to start by having a conversation with you, Jared. An issue that we've been hearing a lot about is wage stagnation. And most recently, we heard about it in the September jobs report. Can you explain what wage stagnation is, and maybe in terms that our viewers can understand?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. Wage stagnation simply refers to a situation where people are working, but their earnings aren't going up when you adjust for inflation. So that means that the buying power of their paychecks are stagnant in terms of how much they can purchase. If your earnings go up, say, 5%, so you made $100 one week and $105 the next week, but prices also go up 5%, that means that your real earnings were stagnant. So I think that, unfortunately, too many people actually know the meaning of earning stagnation, because it's been an extremely common problem, and not just of course, and you and everyone else here well knows this, not just in the September jobs report, but really for the past few decades. In fact, it's not just that earnings have been stagnant, it's that they've been declining for many folks who are in the middle and the bottom of the wage scale. This is particularly germane in the poverty discussion, because I think you very correctly mentioned poverty policy as something that's a critical focus of a panel like this one. Well, poverty policy has increasingly tilted towards work as a way out of poverty. And if people can't find the jobs they need and those jobs aren't paying adequate wages, then the ladder out of poverty is a pretty rickety one. So that's kind of just an overview of the wage stagnation problem. Let me just say one other thing, and then let you cogitate on wherever you want to go. This earnings stagnation problem that we've been talking about, a real earnings decline for folks at the lower end, this is happening amidst an economy where GDP, productivity, and overall growth has been going up. So it's not like the economy itself isn't generating income that could reach the middle and the bottom much more effectively than it does. So now I'm obviously talking about this problem of economic inequality. When you have growth, but that growth kind of does an end run around the middle class and the poor, when it doesn't reach down into the lower, say, half of the income scale, then you have a real wedge, a real inequality-driven wedge between growth and poverty reduction, and that's a big part of the problem we're talking about today.
So is it fair to say that our economic gains since the recovery have not been widely shared?
Not only is it fair to say that, I mean, it's totally accurate to say that, but you could go back well before the recovery. That is, if you go back to, say, the mid-1980s, I mean, I'm going to date myself here, but back in the 1980s, we began to write papers and recognize something that economists were calling sticky poverty rates. Now, that's what does that mean? It means that the economy was growing, but poverty wasn't falling in the way that that relationship had played out in the past. Again, there were a set of intervening factors that were diverting growth from folks in the middle and the lower end of the pay scale. So we began to see poverty become much less responsive to economic growth, and it didn't just start with the recovery. This is, you can go back to the late 1970s to see the beginnings of a problem that persists to this day.
But particularly since the official end of the recession, which obviously is not the way it feels for a lot of this country, the statistic that to me I think reflects the level of inequality that's worsening in this nation is that between 2009 and 2011, 2012, 95% of real income growth was captured by the top 1%.
Right. So that's precisely the point I've been making.
Right. Excellent. So can I maybe ask you then, if that's the problem that we're facing, what kinds of solutions do we have at our disposal?
Well, I like the way you teed things off initially, because you correctly said that this is a policy problem. This isn't something that's just falling from above or actually coming up from below, I guess would be a better analogy. This is something we could do something about. Three ideas come to mind, and since I'm very interested in hearing what my other panelists have to say, let me be very brief here. We can come back to this. Increasing the minimum wage, I think, is a no-brainer in this regard. Remember, we want people to work to get out of poverty. Well, just wanting them to work doesn't mean that they're going to have access to decent jobs. So a higher minimum wage would be associated with more pay, and moderate increases in the minimum wage have historically been shown not to have anything like the negative employment effects that opponents suggest. Two, we could extend the earned income tax credit in a particularly important way so that it reaches childless adults. So adults who don't have kids, now they might be a non-custodial parent, so they might have a kid that doesn't live with them, get actually a very tiny part of this very important tax credit called the Earned Income Tax Credit. I suspect many of our viewers know what I'm talking about. For a family with a couple of kids, this can mean $4,000 or $5,000 a year on top of their earnings, so it can be quite a generous wage subsidy, lifting millions out of poverty. But if you're a childless adult, you typically get only a couple of $100 from the EITC. There's actually some bipartisan energy around extending this part. And the third thing, in many ways to me, is the most important, but it's also the most it requires more explanation than I'll give at least at this initial stage in our discussion, and that's a full employment economy. Okay. The last time we saw poverty falling sharply, and falling most sharply for the most disadvantaged groups, okay? So we're talking about minority households, single mom households of color. The last time we saw poverty falling sharply, I'd be very interested to get to discussion, Daryl's discussion in this context as well, because you saw even people with criminal records were starting to really see improvements. was in the latter 1990s when the economy really achieved full employment. That taught me a very important lesson. If we want to really reach the poor with the economic growth, they need the bargaining power that only a full employment economy delivers to them. So I have a lot of thoughts about how to get there, and maybe we can touch back on that later.
And we absolutely will. We will come back to that a little bit later in the discussion. But right now, I would like to bring Jody into the conversation. So Jody, a recent New York Times article that I think a lot of our viewers might have seen was called "Working Anything But 9 to 5." It profiled a woman who was working at Starbucks, and her work schedule was all over the place. It was never the same 2 days or 2 weeks in a row, changing almost with no notice to her, which made things very difficult for her because she had a child and she was always scrambling to find childcare arrangements. So Jody, can you tell us, is this a common problem for low-wage workers? And if so, can you tell us why that is and kind of how this comes to be and the implications for them?
Well, Rebecca, first, thanks very much for bringing this topic into today's conversation. And I hope it won't be the last time, but I hope it is the last time that you have me following Jared. I don't enjoy doing that at all. And you ask, is this problem common, and and why is it happening? Well, those are good questions to ask at the outset. It is, in fact, more common than I think most of us realize, and it happens because it can. On its very common side, we have new data that tells us how common this practice really is, and it's about 40% of early career workers. Those are the folks in the age group between 26 and 32 who are in hourly jobs. 40%, in fact, learn about their job schedules in the week or less than the week before they start that work week. It's absolutely incredible. And what we know is that half of those folks don't have any input in their schedule, and fully about 3/4 experience significant fluctuation in the number of hours that they get to work in those weeks, as much as 8. So it's a really huge problem. The data is beginning to come through, and we have lots of gratitude to Susan Lambert and other researchers at the University of Chicago for manipulating the National Longitudinal Study of Youth for giving us this new data. Until now, we didn't really have even this level of information. 6 out of every 10 workers, by the way, are hourly. Well, then you ask, and the right question, which is, why is this happening? Well, there's this thing called just-in-time scheduling. And that enables an employer to use very sophisticated logarithms to figure out when demand is going to happen, particularly in the retail industry. So to sort of figure out how many customers are going to show up. Now, they use this logarithm in order to figure out the least amount of staffing that they can get by with. And the reason that they're interested in knowing the least amount of staffing that they can get by with is because many of these employers and corporations view controlling the cost of their labor force as to be a primary way to maximize profits. And this has been a long-held belief. What's really important today for all of us is research that shows ain't got to be so. It's a bad paradigm. It doesn't prove itself, inasmuch as there's been a decade of research, for example, done by Zenit Tan now at MIT, who found that in studying some employers who had lots of lower wage workers, but not as low wage workers, and were also producing not high-end, high-cost products, such as stores like Quick Trip or Trader Joe's, for example. Those places are highly profitable, but they provide stable employment for their employees, higher wages, stable employment. So it's very, very possible and essential, really, to have more employers appreciate the purpose and value of investing in their employees rather than cutting them to the core.
So can you tell us a little bit more about how this really plays out for individuals and families? It doesn't sound pleasant, right, to not know your work schedule before the week that it starts, but what does that really mean?
What it really means is brilliantly conveyed in that New York Times story that you mentioned that Jody Cantor did in August. And if any of your listeners today on your show haven't read that piece, I would really, really encourage it. It's a lengthy, well, not too lengthy, but it's a really detailed picture of what happens in one person's life. Jeanette Navarro, is 22. She's a Starbucks barista, and the story goes through how her schedule, just the schedule itself, the work schedule, and the instability it created by not knowing what was going to happen next for the next day or anything, and she had a young child, what it meant to her boyfriend, what it meant to her family. The net result for this young woman, who everybody agreed was a terrific worker, was that she both lost her boyfriend. He could not handle the lack of predictability any longer. She lost her boyfriend, and that relationship ended, and she lost her home. So those kinds of stories, unfortunately, are not unusual. But getting back to the basics, for anybody going through this, all of the Jeanette Navarros, it means you don't know how much money you're going to have when you don't have a steady source of income, and your number of hours fluctuates so much. So how can you budget? How can you know if you're going to make rent if you cannot predict how many hours you're going to have? How do you know how much you have for milk the next day if you don't know what you're going to have next week? So it affects everybody's budget. It affects those with children, particularly those in the child caring years as well as after school. How do you know what are your hours of need when your schedules shift? And it has impact as well on your child care subsidy, depending upon your state rules, because they may need to match with your hours, and you have to provide paperwork, and states have made choices that sometimes this paperwork piece is holding folks back. So it's budgeting, it's child care, and for the world of low-wage workers who know they need higher education in order to get higher wage jobs, it wreaks havoc on their academic schedules as well. So in essence, it wreaks havoc if your job is unstable by making your life unstable.
And briefly, before we turn to Daryl, because this is, you painted such a compelling portrait of what this problem really looks like. Can you maybe briefly touch on some of what the solutions might be?
Sure, and there are public policy solutions, just as Jared was saying about the economy. There's nothing inevitable about what employers are doing, and there are a variety of great ideas being developed both in cities and at the federal level. There's a federal bill called the Schedules That Work Act. There's developments in San Francisco and New York City, and there will be elsewhere in 2015, we anticipate. But these are provisions that run the gamut and basically fall into two categories. One is a universal right to request a change in your schedule. And why that's important is that we need to change the gestalt of our society, to flip it from one in which schedules can be unpredictable to one in which an employee has a chance to contribute their needs to a decision-making process and to change the whole orientation to scheduling. One of the scary parts about what happens today in schedules that are challenged with volatile schedules is that employees who say and ask for a change in their schedule are often retaliated against. So if you basically say, I need to get home at 6, can we do this in our office? Then the employer may give them fewer hours. So that's a real big problem. Other ideas that are now cropping up include requiring employers who disregard and don't pay an employee who's been on call and requires them, they show up and they have no work, to pay a little bit of a penalty. So some penalties are being infused into laws and policies that are being considered so that these poor practices are flipped around. Part of the solution as well is using that very technology that's creating this just-in-time problem for scheduling and flipping it to figure out how to make employees' schedules most stable and still profitable for employers, and all of that is possible.
This is great. So we're definitely going to get back to more of this as the conversation continues, but in the meantime, I'd like to turn it over to Daryl. So Daryl, thank you for waiting so patiently. We've saved the last for best, right, or the best for last. So Daryl, something that's getting a lot of attention lately is the issue of mass incarceration, right? I think and I'm so glad to finally really be seeing a lot in the news about this issue in a way that really, I think, respects the humanity of the people that we're talking about and starts to really paint people who interact with the criminal justice system and their families in a sympathetic light, which is really a change. I think a sea change in how we've seen that play out. But something that has gotten less attention, and which I'd really love for you to talk a little bit about today, is really what I think of as the back end of that problem, right? According to the Department of Justice, as many as 100 million Americans, that's fully 1 in 3 Americans, have some type of criminal record. So can you tell us a little bit about what that stat means? Can you unpack that for us? And then tell us, what impact does a criminal record have on individuals and families?
Sure. So I'd like to begin, Rebecca, just by thanking you for having me on the program. It's such a pleasure to be on this program with esteemed panelists like Jared and Judy. When you think about 100 million Americans, 1 in 3 people having a criminal record, that illustrates that our criminal justice system has really just grown beyond the size that we really need. People are being criminalized for very trivial and low-level things, and it really negatively impacts their ability to access opportunity, to be able to participate in mainstream economy, to be able to get an education, to be able to live in a home or rent an apartment. So when you're convicted of a crime, or even arrested for a crime, you have direct consequences. Your fine, your imprisonment, your potential probation. But you also have indirect consequences, things that are triggered because of your criminal justice involvement that happen outside of the criminal justice system. So if you're convicted of a felony, many people are familiar, you may lose your right to vote or to serve for public office, but there are many, many more. If you're convicted of even low-level misdemeanor convictions like turnstile jumping or misdemeanor possession of marijuana, they trigger hundreds, sometimes thousands of collateral consequences, which can impact your ability to get employment and occupational licenses. And so many of our professions are regulated now, and they require certifications and permits and various types of qualifications that the licensing board kind of governmental agency has to give. And oftentimes, criminal record history negatively impacts a person's ability to be able to get those various permits and occupational licenses. As a result, they can't participate in mainstream economy. So these civil punishments really, in many estimations, when you think about the disproportionate impact that the criminal justice system has on African Americans and Latinos, they really represent a new form of structural discrimination that keeps people to the margins of being able to participate in the mainstream economy. As a result, they just cycle in and out of the criminal justice system and stay perpetually stuck in a cycle of poverty.
So actually, you I think just provided the perfect segue to then my next question. So you mentioned barriers to employment, to housing, to education, to all sorts of things. So is it fair to say that having even a minor criminal record, and you even mentioned having just an arrest without a conviction, can that really effectively present a barrier to economic security, let alone mobility?
Absolutely. It can present a barrier to even getting an entry-level job. At the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, we do a combination of direct legal services where we help people on a case-by-case basis overcome those barriers, but we also do policy work where we're trying to change more of the systemic policy structure so people can have access to opportunity and participate in the American dream. And we see folks who have been convicted of misdemeanor convictions, sometimes even an arrest record, can negatively impact and influence an employer's decision on giving someone a job, can influence a university's decision on admitting someone into school, can influence a landlord's or a renter, a leaseholder's decision in giving someone an apartment. And all of these negatively impact someone's life and their ability to participate in society.
So can you tell us a little bit then, Daryl, about what some of the policy solutions might be? I mean, I think both Jared and Jody have said that the problems that they've described with stagnant and declining wages and with these erratic and unpredictable schedules, that those are not inevitable problems, that they're in effect the direct result of policy choices. Are there different policy choices that we can make, or are there policy solutions that we have at our disposal that can break the link between having even a minor criminal record and being unable to escape a cycle of poverty?
Absolutely. And so to begin with, recently the National Academy of Sciences issued a landmark report, Mass Incarceration, Its Consequences and Causes. So to begin with, let's talk about how we can slow down the pipeline of people coming into the system. That was a policy choice. We can change some of those policies to slow the pipeline down so we don't have so many people coming in contact with prisoner jail, coming in contact with the criminal justice system. But we can also enact policies on the back end that help people have access to opportunity. So for example, I talked about the really harmful effects of having a criminal record, and there are things that you can do about that. You can provide more access to be able to seal or erase those records after a certain amount of time. So we have expungement laws, we have things called certificates of relief, which mitigate the impact of a criminal record. But then you can also encourage employers to delay questions about criminal record history until later on in the employment process. And we actually did that campaign. It's called Ban the Box. It was started by a group of formerly incarcerated people in the Bay Area called All of Us or None. And I think that's a very noteworthy fact that we should put forth, because the experts are great, but sometimes you can find the best solutions just by going to the people most directly affected by the problem and asking them what they need. So directly impacted folks came up with this policy solution, and we ran a Ban the Box campaign in Durham. We passed that policy in 2011 and in 2012 at the city and the county levels, and since that time, we've seen the percentage of people hired by the city increase every single year since the policy was passed. In 2011, the percentage of people hired with criminal records by the city out of their total number of hires was about 2.2%. In 2012, it went up to 4.5%. In 2013, it was at 9%. And thus far this year, 15% out of the total number of hires by the city of Durham have been people with criminal records. But we haven't seen any increases in workplace theft or crime, so there's not a public safety hit. You're putting people back to work. You're reducing their potential to recidivate, because evidence has shown the most successful intervention in reducing people repeat offending is giving them a job. It's not rocket science, right? When you have a legal, viable way to make a living, they don't go back to an underground economy. So it facilitates public safety, and it also expands the qualified applicant pool for employers. They have a greater applicant pool of qualified workers. And so we've seen that public policy work in Durham, North Carolina, and that's something that can be done at the federal level. The president could issue an executive order that effectively delays questions about criminal record history to all federal jobs and independent contractors with the federal government, and that could be an excellent policy initiative to help put people with records back to work.
So this feels like a really good opportunity to tie some of these three areas together. I think very often we think and we talk about individual topics within the anti-poverty space as though they're within silos, as though they're standalone issues. But I'm really hearing a lot that actually weaves together these key areas that you guys have each spoken about. And so, Daryl, you were talking about a criminal record as a barrier to employment, which I feel ties in with a lot of what Jared was talking about. So maybe, Jared, can we go back to you briefly? Can you maybe tie in what you were starting to talk about full employment, and does that at all relate to what we've been hearing about from Daryl?
Right. I think both Daryl and Jody were hitting on really important points that I think as a nerdy economist, I'd kind of put into the bins of job quality and job quantity. In terms of the latter, just the number of available jobs, one of the problems with some of the conservative rhetoric in this debate is that the assumption is way too often made, if you want a job, you can have a job. It's only just about, what you think of kind of just a supply side way of thinking about this. The only thing standing between a poor person and a decent job is some personal failing. They don't want a decent job. but the decent jobs are all out there. Those of us who've worked in this space, and referring back to Daryl, those of us who've lived in this space, many of the folks he was talking about, know very well that there are significant constraints on both the quantity and the quality of jobs, both in terms of compensation, but quality in terms of the scheduling issues Jody was talking about. Those are amenable to policy. Daryl's comments about ban the box are very germane in this context. I'd like to throw something else out, though, that I think is really key. There's a very detailed agenda having to do with macroeconomics and the Federal Reserve and fiscal policy and trade deficits when it comes to getting to full employment. But there's something particularly important vis-a-vis poverty, which is that if the market by itself fails to provide the adequate quantity and quality of jobs that poor people need to work their way out of poverty, able-bodied, working-age poor people, then we have a responsibility to provide those jobs for them if we want them to work their way out of poverty. If we want to sprinkle cash on them and say, go ahead and go off and be okay, that would be one thing, but that's not the model. The model is we want you to work your way out of poverty. Fine. Then we have to make sure they have a decent job. Therefore, it's been my experience that the market underprovides the quality and the quantity of jobs needed by the poor. So we need subsidized employment programs, direct job programs, to help people get back into the labor market. It doesn't have to be forever. It can be a 6-month program. And I suspect both Daryl and Jody, I know CLASP has done a ton of work on this, know about the research that shows that when you help somebody, even someone who may be somewhat tenuously connected to the job market, get into a decent subsidized job for 6 months. After that subsidy ends, oftentimes their employer thinks, hey, this is a great worker. So I would say direct employment is a real key component here.
And Jody, did you have anything you wanted to add, perhaps either about subsidized employment, maybe the TANF emergency fund, and the lessons it might provide for us in that space?
Yes, I think that it's great to have mentioned subsidized employment as a vehicle for assisting in those who have tangential attachment to the workforce or are unemployed, get back into the workforce. I think a lot of the issue here, and we have data about the TANF emergency fund use in subsidized employment.
I'm going to stop you there real quick. So tell us, what was the TANF emergency fund?
You might go better into detail on that, but it enabled states to tap funds to create these subsidized employment strategies, and in a number of places did so. And what's very compelling about what came out of some of those findings is that just what Jared was saying, employers got excited because they found employees who were great and they had no idea. The other piece of it that was very, very exciting, and Rebecca, I don't know if you know about this piece because it thrilled me, and I don't know that it got much attention because maybe it was just from a conversation I had with a TANF state director once, but here's the point. He mentioned that what was thrilling about this program was that people who were in the welfare agency working on this program were excited by their jobs because they had now something tangible that really was a stepping stone for people, and it absolutely gave everybody hope, not just the person who'd been unemployed, who'd been hard-pressed to get a job, but the agency itself. It saw the future. And so I couldn't agree more with what Jared's saying, that these kinds of real jobs, we're not talking about make work, but real jobs, and having those available for folks who need them would be awesome.
And bringing things full circle a little bit, the TANF Emergency Fund is a program that has been close to my heart because when I was a legal aid attorney in Philadelphia, working at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, and Daryl working with a lot of the same clients that you see day in and day out in Durham, the TANF Emergency Fund was an opportunity for the state of Pennsylvania to create a program called Way to Work Pennsylvania. And the end result was that 20,000 jobs were created for a combination of young adults and working age folks who were living in poverty, and many of those individuals had criminal records, and that was the thing standing between them and a job. And it was one of the most rewarding parts of my work in legal aid, because watching people connect with those employers and then really see their lives turned around literally in the space of just a few months, it was nothing short of amazing. So hopefully lessons that we can learn from the TANF Emergency Fund. Our line is falling down. Oh dear, we need technical assistance, Sarah. So I think that is perhaps our cue to see if we have any questions from the audience. So I'm going to take a look and see. Lots of questions coming in from Twitter and Facebook. So here's a question that may actually be one for Jared. We have a question asking, is fixing the gender wage gap a policy that would have an impact on the poverty rate? Jared, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yes, and it reminds me, first of all, the answer is of course, because just to be clear, the gender wage gap is a way of describing the fact that women are often paid less than men for doing the same job. So if you bring women's pay up so that you equalize that in that direction, by the way, obviously, it will provide more income and thus less poverty. Here's the thing. Guess which gender benefits the most from an increase in the minimum wage? I mean, it's a slam dunk. It's women, because women are disproportionately working in lower wage jobs, partly due to the gender pay gap that we've been discussing. I'm not saying that there aren't considerable numbers of men, but that would benefit as well. But I think it's something in the range of 60-40 in terms of the share of women who would benefit relative to men when it comes to increasing the minimum wage. So that piece of the policy solution discussion we've been having, I think, would both help reduce that gender wage gap and lower working poverty.
Great. So another question that we have gotten from a viewer is about paid leave and paid sick days. And the question is, how would paid leave and paid sick days tie in with the issue of job schedule volatility? So Jody, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Yes, thanks, and thanks for that question, whoever you are. It's a great question. We think that a lot of the employers who have poor practices with regard to scheduling also have poor policy with respect to paid sick days and paid family medical leave. There is no federal law right now that provides for paid sick days or paid family medical leave, resulting in, for example, 40% of the U.S. workforce not having paid sick days. What this means is that workers are challenged when they're sick, a child is sick, they need to take family medical leave, in losing days' wages or many days' wages, and even more so than that, a real risk of losing their jobs. We know from one study, for example, that 1 out of every 7 low-wage workers reported having lost their jobs within the last 4 years just because they became sick or someone they were caring for became sick. So this is a direct hit on poverty. You have a job, you've got a wage, and you lose it because of the conditions of employment. So it's a great question. It's a troubling fact about poverty as well because of job loss.
Thank you for that. So the next question is for Daryl. And Daryl, well, I'm choosing that it's going to Daryl. Not designated, but Daryl, this one's for you.
That could be the king. Wait.
Someone else wants to take it. So Daryl, this question is asking if the EITC and the minimum wage are policies that would benefit people with criminal records. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. You know, most of the folks who we come in contact with are working service jobs, entry-level employment, so increasing their minimum wage would be a direct benefit to increasing what they take home and what they would be able to use to provide for their families. You know, if I could just broaden the discussion just for a moment, Rebecca, I think, you know, in addition to these policy shifts, I think we really need to work on shifting culture and how we fundamentally think about poor people in this country. and whether we are going to create a policy environment that enlarges that we, that we the people that we talk about in the preamble. And right now, we don't have a policy environment that really fundamentally creates opportunity for those folks to be included in the we. Are they part of the Americans that we want to have access to the American dream? And we need to really ask ourselves that. Ask ourselves, do we want single moms to be included in to access to opportunity in the country? Ask ourselves, do we want black and brown people to fundamentally have access to opportunity in this country? And that's a harder cultural question that one single law can't fix. But I think it's a discussion that we have to start having.
Was someone about to try to get in on that? Thought I heard something. Okay. Well, thank you for saying that. And actually, Daryl, that's one of the primary goals here at Talk Poverty, is to really be making sure that we engage low-income people in the conversation, so that they are them speaking on their own behalf, so that they're not the object of policy, but rather agents in improving policy and in educating policymakers about what kinds of policy choices we could make. Another question I wanted to ask, and I'm going to pose this to all three of you, it is sort of about the political environment that we're in. Jared mentioned that we're seeing glimmers of bipartisanship in calls for expanding the EITC in various ways. We've seen very similar proposals coming out of both President Obama and also Budget Chairman Paul Ryan, who is a Republican. I wanted to pose that question about all three of these policy issues. Is this something that we see the potential for movement in within the existing political climate, and potentially bipartisan agreement on the policy solutions that we've been talking about? And maybe let me turn to Jared first.
Geez. I was hoping that I didn't want to go first on this one because I don't have a very uplifting answer. I think there's very little chance of much useful legislation in the areas we're talking about, bipartisan level at all. I'm glad to hear some of the folks you mentioned talking about, say, the expansion to the earned income credit by adding a component for childless adults. But then when you kind of get under the surface and you see, well, if we agree to that, here's what you have to give us in return, you hear all kinds of totally unacceptable stuff. And I would actually, I'll name a name here. If you look at Paul Ryan's budgetary ideas in the area of poverty, they're massive cuts that would do tremendous damage to the populations we're talking about, and very much gut the kinds of programs and policies that Jody and Daryl and I have been talking about. So I'm pessimistic on that front. However, leave off, I will say that there's some good stuff happening at the subnational level. And in fact, I think that to the extent that listeners are interested, some of the stuff Daryl was talking about is clearly happening at the level of states and cities. So listeners should not despair, but they should probably kind of despair a little bit of Washington, vis-a-vis Washington, at least in the near term. And by the way, just a tiny codicil. When I say despair, I don't mean that the system is permanently broken. In fact, I actually believe that if we had a group of members up here from all sides of the aisle who remembered how to work together and compromise, we could get somewhere. But we don't have that group.
So, Jody, I'll turn it to you with the hope that you're going to be a little bit more optimistic.
Well, I am inherently an optimist, but I have to agree with Jared that it's particularly challenging in this Congress, and encouraged a lot by the fact that things are moving almost exponentially in the states and localities around the issues I've been addressing today, including significant wins in paid sick days, 10 cities and states now, just in the last couple of years. So that's very encouraging. We're seeing that in paid family leave. We're seeing this real explosion of interest in policy around scheduling that's happening. And I think that this reflects a public that's demanding action and workers who are organizing in different ways, in different approaches, in different locations. So it's on the consciousness. And, you know, we're a we've always been, no matter what the political climate was, a very big ship that's hard to steer. It takes a long while. Added to that, this political dissonance at the congressional level, it requires state and localities to pave the way often.
Thank you for that, and I want to give Daryl a chance to get in on this too, because maybe this is actually a space where there is a lot of optimism, and we have been hearing a lot of discussion from all parts of the political spectrum about criminal justice reform. Daryl, am I right about that?
You're right that we have been hearing a lot. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to agree with my co-panelists that I don't have a great deal of hope about legislation moving through Congress. So, for example,
pessimistic panel we have today, guys.
Realistic.
So, for example, Senator Rand Paul and Senator Booker, drafted a really good bill, the REDEEM Act, that looked at, erasing federal criminal records for people who had been convicted of nonviolent drug offenses. And it also had some other good stuff in the bill as well. I don't have any iota of hope that that's going to make it through our really hamstrung Congress, because folks, as Jared pointed out, folks just don't want to work together. But there are things that the executive branch can do absent congressional approval. So, for example, I'm going to reiterate an executive order banning the box on all federal employment and independent contractors with the federal government. That's something the administration can do without congressional approval. But really, most of the action is happening at the states. And it's really interesting, really traditional red states, Georgia, North Carolina, even Louisiana and Mississippi, we're starting to see a change in tone, mainly because state budgets went broke after 2008, and we couldn't afford our current addiction to mass incarceration and keeping people in a perpetual cycle of criminality and poverty. So now there are opportunities to take some of that same rhetoric. Take Paul Ryan, for example, taking people from takers to makers. Okay, if you want to do that, you have to give people access to a job. And one way to do that is with policy prescriptions like ban the box, with increasing sealing and legislation that mitigates the impact of a criminal record.
So it sounds like then a shared level of optimism at the state and local level in all these areas.
Well, I want to add, I want to just echo something Daryl said. Yes, state and local, but also executive order. I thought that was an interesting point he made, and it's very consistent with actions that the administration has taken, particularly in the space of federal contractors, of which there are millions. I mean, we do. I've heard the number 20 million. I'm not sure if that's correct, but it's probably ballpark. We do $500 billion of federal contracting every year, and to the extent that the administration can make a change like that, it'd be very positive.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for all of your time and also your insights. This was a wonderful discussion. And thank you to everyone who's been watching today and participating in Talk Poverty Live. Before you go, don't close out yet. Here are some opportunities to get involved with Half in 10 and with TalkPoverty.org. You can write a blog post. You can email info@talkpoverty.org if you want to pitch an idea that you have for a post to go on talkpoverty.org. You can submit your own personal story, or if you're an advocate, you can submit the story of one of your clients or someone that you've worked with on the ground. And you can do that at halfin10.org/Our American Story and join the Our American Story Storyteller Action Network. You can become an expert on poverty in your state or locality by exploring the resources on talkpoverty.org, which includes newly updated state-by-state data and opportunities to plug into state and local organizations doing great work near you. And you can take action by signing up to receive timely action alerts at halfin10.org. And of course, we have to close with a shameless plug that you can tune in next month to Talk Poverty Live, when we'll be having another discussion like we did today on another topic having to do with anti-poverty work. If you have feedback, we want to hear from you and know what you think about Talk Poverty Live, as well as what conversations you would be most interested in listening to and participating in moving forward. So again, you can email your thoughts and your feedback and ideas to info@talkpoverty.org. as well as make nominations for future poverty heroes. So thank you so much for everyone joining Talk Poverty Live, and we look forward to seeing you next month.